Uh, so let us start. Formally, let me welcome all of you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Cuts International, I welcome all of you to this webinar. This is the second of a series of webinars that we are doing to launch a new project of ours, which is supported by the Department for International Development of the United Kingdom under its Asia Regional Trade and Connectivity Program. So under that program, which is going to go on at least till 2022, we are a partner for in other projects as well. One of them is on gender and trade in BBIN sub-region. The other one is on border huts between India and Bangladesh. So this project is on multi-modal. Now we have been talking about connectivity for quite some time, particularly after the I would not like to use the word failure, but here I have no other choice. Uh, After the non-signing, let me say, of the SARC Motor Vehicles Agreement in Kathmandu in 2014. With that, let me welcome Ambassador Karim. I think he has joined. So we are doing this project on multimodal connectivity, which is, I think, there is some substantial uh, political will behind connectivity nowadays. So let me now, I was just stepping in for Ambassador Karim. Ambassador Karim doesn't require any introduction. He was Bangladesh's High Commissioner to India. Now he's, after retirement, as he's perhaps much more active as an advisor to the World Bank on regional integration and related issues. He has vast knowledge, historical, practical, technical, all taken together. So over to you, Ambassador Karim. This is how I would like you to go to take us through. After your opening remarks, you would request Mr. Kwon Cheng Wang from the Asian Development Bank for making his presentation. It will take about 12 to 15 minutes for his presentation. And then starting with Professor Rahman, we are going to have our panel discussion. So over to you, Ambassador Karim.
Thank you very much, Bipul. Well, where should I begin? Let me begin at the beginning that, as your note says, we transformed ourselves, and let us not blame outsiders for this. Outsiders will always be interfering. From being the most integrated to the least integrated region in the world, for which all of us, all the countries that emerged, have paid a grievous price in terms of social development, economic development, and also paid a price politically. Today, I think when we are grappling with this global pandemic, which has taken the whole world back to the times of the Great Depression of the 30s, we are also on the brink of similar disaster unless we know what to do and how to retrieve it. There will be there already are grave economic consequences, which could translate into social unrest and socio-economic consequences, which could translate into political problems. Each country will seek to close itself. This is where policymakers have to exercise wisdom, foresight, sagacity. We embarked on a process called regional cooperation. That did not work. We grappled with it, and finally we said, okay, maybe sub-regional will work. Sub-regional concept, which I had a little role to play in first tabling way back in 1995, did not take off until after the present political dispensations in Bangladesh, at least in 2008 and 2009 came into being. That is when what you said earlier, that political will, because of political will, which is the key, it is like the electrical system of the engine of a car. You have the most beautifully designed engine, but the car is not going to go anywhere if the engine does not kick into life when you turn the ignition. That is the political will. And then once that happened, slowly, it took a few years, BBIN, it took another 4 years before, or 3 years before the idea was floated, that BBIN finally took the first hesitant steps forward. It started in 2015, January, with the declaration by the first the senior officials, and then the ministers went and signed the agreement in Bhutan. And we had the BBIN MVA, which every regional organization or entity, whether you take the European Union or you take the ASEAN or you take the South African Development Cooperation Framework, that was the thing that they realized first, that we must have connectivity. In order to increase trade, increase prosperity, even if we dislike each other, we must have connectivity. And that is what we set out to do. We have made some progress, but we have not made the progress that I had hoped for or yearned for when I set out on that journey. Somewhere it gets stuck. It has not, the BBIN MVA has not yet operationalized because ratification by Bhutan has been held up. There are different reasons behind that, not the place to go into now. In the meantime, we are trying as much as possible to get water connectivity going. We have, thank God, we have the coastal shipping agreement and the direct maritime merchant marine agreement. These are things which were normal, which were part of our lives until 80 years ago or 70 years ago or even 65 years ago. Then we chopped our own legs. These are there, but it's still a long way to go. We need perseverance for this. The waterways, when people talk to me about landlocked countries in South Asia and in India, I say, why do you talk about landlocked? Why do you forget the landlocked narrative is only about 70 years old. What was the narrative before 70 years ago? For millennia, this was a water-linked region. The waters were our life. It gave birth to us, it sustained us. And when it's overpowering, it also kills us. But we somehow manage these waters, we learn to live in them, swim in them, thrive and prosper in them. And that is what made Bengal one of the richest entities, even in historical civilizational India. It made the Bengal presidency the richest presidency of the British when they ruled over us for extraction. The British knew what they were doing, which we seem to have forgotten. They knew that the heart of prosperity here was keeping the waterways active. To that, they brought in the technology and added one of the finest railway networks in the world. The roads are the most difficult because of the terrain. Our climate, our soil, our geomorphology does not allow us to spend money and keep toiling at putting roads into place. Roads are the capillaries of the body. The arteries are the rivers, our Bay of Bengal, and the veins are our railways. That is how I see connectivity taking place, and that is where the importance of multimodality comes into being. What You cannot transport from the hubs to the distance places where goods are produced or goods are to be delivered. You use the smaller local roads or the highways where you can construct it. But basically, you have to revive the waterways, which is not only the most economic, it saves about 60% of expenditure that we spend on roads and perhaps a little more on railways. It cuts down our carbon emission by more than 65%. And this, Indians have done the research on this and come out first. This is what we have to come back to. And right now, today, last year was said to be the hottest. This year is said to be hotter. The Food and Agriculture Organization have already warned us, prepare for deaths from starvation, which will be higher and outpace the numbers of the highest death from the coronavirus daily, globally. What does that do to us? If that is the situation, we are the most densely, most heavily populated region in the world. The whole of South Asia has perhaps 1.5, close to 1.5 billion people. Poverty in Bangladesh, as a result of the coronavirus, 25% more people have been added to below the poverty line. Now the figure is somewhere close to between 45 and 50% of the total population of Bangladesh. And of this, the new poor who have emerged in the last 3 months are the urban new poor. These are not the helpless, ignorant poor. They have access to information, they think for themselves, they compare things, and if they hurt, this is a recipe for disaster. We have to first consolidate nationally, but then forget globalization, which existed 4 months ago, is not going to happen immediately. We each have our own problems. In Bangladesh, the greatest problem is we became overly dependent on one industry for our export earnings, and that was garments. 85% almost of our export revenues came from garments. That's down to less than 50%. And whether it will go any higher, I hope and pray it will. I doubt it very much, because why do you produce something? Somebody has to buy it. At the purchasing end, the maximum it is purchased, the biggest markets are in Europe and in America. They are shutting down. We have to look to our own market. We have to reorient ourselves. We have to rediscover ourselves. And the people in the urban areas, since the last 2 weeks, the reports are steady. The new poor are migrating back to the villages from where they migrated to the urban areas about 10 or 20 years ago. They found prosperity. That is what translated into what we call the informal sector, the service sector. That sector is shattered and it's not going to revive. How long can the government keep subsidies? What we need to do, I think, is go back to our roots. In Bangladesh, I'm talking of Bangladesh, India will have slightly different configurations and problems and challenges. Our strength, the backbone was always our agriculture. We have to split up urban into not one center, from one center to 6 or 7 centers. Develop the rural agriculture, the agro industries. They should be near the borders. When we have a food crisis, all of us will have a food crisis, not just Bangladesh. You will have internal problems of logistics communication, as we will have. That is where you will rediscover yourself and find your reconnectivity useful. And that is why we need to have the connectivity going. We need to keep this agenda alive. What could trip it up? And I'll be very blunt in it. It'll again be the politics. What prevented us from doing what we should have done 60 years ago was the politics. If the spark plugs of a 4 or 5 or 6 cylinder engine don't fire in harmony the engine doesn't start, the machine doesn't run. We have to fire in harmony politically. And here, I think, in a sense, perhaps the larger one among us has a heavier responsibility to share. And I say this deliberately, keeping in mind how EU developed, how ASEAN developed, how the SADC developed. These are the three regional organizations with which I have some familiarity. They developed because the larger country had the bigger heart. It ceded, it conceded, it helped. And unless that happens here, unless we all subsume ourselves to a larger historical, civilizational identity that we once possessed, we will be like a body with its arms and limbs cut off. I'm being deliberately blunt because now I think it's not the time to do pussyfooting around. We have to face reality. If we want to achieve a target, we have to know what is preventing us from going there. And then we have to find out how do we minimize that. It'll be there, it'll always be there. But how do we sequester that from preventing us from going forward? The direction will not be linear. I have learned from my own experience. Ideas you sow, this idea of sub-regional cooperation came in 1995. It actually came into life in 2015. How many years is that? SAARC came into being in 1885. It is still comatose. I commend Prime Minister Modi for having taken the initiative of reviving meetings of the SAARC heads of states or governments. Almost all of them did. At least identifying one or two areas, I think that's what we have got to do. If you want regional cooperation, trying to be everywhere, doing everything, we are not going to be getting anywhere. We have to identify a few things, focus all our energy on those few things, make them work and succeed. That will create those successes will create the ground for building the way to more successes, of expanding it. It has to go in progression, step by step. I'll stop there. Thank you. You're mute.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And with your permission, may I now request Mr. Kwencheng Wang from the Asian Development Bank. He's a senior transport specialist for making his presentation. We are going to put his presentation on the screen. So let me now request my colleagues to put the presentation on the screen. But in the meanwhile, it may take about 30 seconds. Kwencheng, you can, over to you.
Thank you, people, for your introduction, and Ambassador Karen, and panelist, and conference participant. It is my great pleasure to attend this session following the first session last Tuesday. Well, I would like to particularly thank for Ambassador Karen's insightful opening speeches. Which I wish I could change my presentation to echo his point. But anyway, that's indeed a lot of issues that we can give a second thought and to have more discussion. So I'm presenting some of the material based on the experience of ADB. My department, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, has, simply speaking, is a knowledge department which support the regional departments. We have a different sector, energy, education, and I belong to transport. We also have some thematic groups. One of them is RCI, certainly is closely related to today's topic. But this time, my regional department colleagues give me a lot of support for preparing this presentation. I would like to thank them. So next slide, please. I was asked to provide some experience for CARAC and the GMS, for which ADB has been serving as a secretariat. And so I will say something about what we have learned from these two sub-regional cooperation, and I will highlight a few such ongoing work and issues. But I know most of the conference participants know this much better than I do. And then I would say a particular project working on a strategic multi-sub-region and a multi-mode transport planning model. Frankly speaking, I know this is the best because that's the project I'm managing. Okay, so that's the outline of my presentation. Yeah, next please. Okay, I won't cover too much details about the background about CARAC because I think you have this information. It's a body of 11 member countries. Until roughly last year, we have there are about 204 projects, and this among them 38.6 billions, and the ADB country part of it. In addition to the effort of other partners and the government. And I want to highlight transport is the major sector for this project, for the investment in CARAC. Third quarters of the project was about transport. And for the CARAC Strategy 2030, that's the latest strategic framework that's also focused on trade in the economic corridors and infrastructure in the economic connectivity. So that's I would like to highlight that this project or the topic People's Team is working on is timely and impactful. It's aligned with the agenda of other sub-regional corporations. And for specifically for CARAC transport strategy, you also notice that the cross-border transport and the logistics highlighted as well. Okay, yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so here is the institutional framework of CARAC. I think most of the sub-regional cooperation program has a similar institutional work, and they have some focused area. So they have different levels of meeting, and we also have other development partners. But I want to highlight one thing is that how you regularly make the pipeline. And the pipeline I mentioned right now is about the high-level meeting, the senior officers meeting, the subsectors and the expert groups. Have you put them all in a sequence and work in a harmonized way so you can keep producing meaningful output based on institutional requirement? And also I would highlight CARAC as an institute, their knowledge arm, which is good for to provide deeper knowledge and to accumulate their knowledge as well. And the other issue is that private sector participation is always a key, a big issue. Yeah. And next, please. And well, I do not want to say too much about the details about the corridors. There are 6 corridors for CARAC, and there are 2 modes illustrated in these figures: roads and the railways. This area also have a relatively good neural networks. However, the development for the past several decades has been focusing on roads. It happens in other areas as well. So right now they are rebuilding their railway networks. But normally when we talk about corridor development, people always focus on road network first. This is, I think that's somehow related to Ambassador Karen's points about which mode we should consider, and traditionally, or why we put emphasis on roads. And I still can say that for the ADB's pipeline for the next 3 years, road projects are still the mainstream, even though we have put a lot of focus on other modes and given the consideration such as climate change and emission reduction. Okay, so next one, please. And the CARAC began to think about the cross-border transport agreement in 2015. That's the ideal situation is that you can have the freedom of transit, but there has been a lot of work to be worked on the traffic rights, customs, and harmonize the regulations, the licensing issue about the drivers, all kind of issues. But for this particular issue about a cross-border transport agreement, I will use another example from GMS, which is more comprehensive and well developed as a better point to illustrate the idea. Okay, but this is an illustration to let you know CAREC is working on this issue as well. Yep. And next one, please. And the key challenge and the forward. This slide, I got this slide from my colleague, which this is part of the presentation for the implementation progress and the way forward that's presented in the 18th Ministry Conference just the last year, before the end of that last year. And the three issues has been highlighted. First one, country's ownership. Okay, so you have to make sure that country has the commitment, they align the sub-regional initiative with the national strategy. Okay, so you probably can change everything here, CAREC, replace CAREC by BBIN. I think that's applied to most of the sub-regional. So you also emphasize the leadership in the high-level participation. That's about ownership. The second one is about financing, because we also notice there's a big gap between the investment list and the finance. So how to use innovative financing arrangement to close the gap is still quite important. And the ADB certainly is working with other development partners to try to narrow the gap. And also very important is that to try to promote the private sector participation or the PPP arrangement. That's also very crucial. The third one is about the institutional mechanism. Of course, the first one is about ADB's role as a secretariat, but the second one is how about you activate your expert groups to have a very solid technical foundation for all of the project. And hopefully that you also can work on collaboration with other cooperation platforms. So that's the three things highlights in the ministerial conference last year for CAREC. Okay. So for this, I quickly finished the slides about CAREC. So next, let's move to about GMS, which is a lot more comprehensive and certainly because of the longer history. So CAREC has a very long history, about six member countries starting in 1992. They are more focus areas when compared CAREC, but still transport and the trade facilitation are two very important components over there. And 102 investment project, ADB share about 40% of them. And the latest transport sector strategy, I would like to highlight, they emphasize the link with South Asia and the Southeastern Asia. Also, they want to facilitate cross-border transport, strengthening intermodal links, and promoting logistics. And I think you have noticed that indeed the multi-modal connectivity or the focus of this project and why we are here are in line with the agenda of other sub-region. So this project is indeed very timely and impactful. Okay, so let's move to the next slide, please. So the very strategic framework about GMS. So you will have noticed that there's a mechanism who decided the three economic corridors: east to west, north, south, and the south. So you can three major economic corridors. On the other hand, the transport strategy was developed to support the development of economic corridors. So that's then we down to the national, subnational development plans. Okay, so that's a very high level framework. So let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So this is the timeline, the milestone about the CBTA, or the cross-border transport facilitating agreement milestones for GMS. You can notice that it was dated back to 1999 when the draft agreement was signed and ratified. It takes 4 years for the countries to sign agreement, and then it takes another 2 years to develop the annexes, the protocols. So they end up with a long list of annex and the protocol. So a lot of involvement from ADB and the member countries. So the countries ratified the annexes and the protocols accordingly. Then they move to the next phase that the people talking about the implementation, the bilateral MOU, how to down to the details about the implementation stage. So I think that you can notice that it does take a lot of longer time than expected to have this wonderful idea realized. Okay. Yeah. Next, please. So I would like to highlight some of the lessons. These are the lessons listed in the transport strategy 2030. I won't just roughly go through all of the points. First of all, the first, I think this lesson could be also very useful for BBIN or for other sub-regional cooperation programs. First of all, you cannot has to be adaptive. So you have the arrangement or the things has to be evolved to reflect the changing environment. Even though there's no issue about COVID-19, things has been changing very quickly. So you have to be adaptive. That's the first lesson. Second one is that you need to increase the private sector participation because of their, in addition to finance, their expertise, their efficiency, and they help build up the market to make the whole things functionable. So the increased private sector participation. And the third one is, well, I think that's also very important, is that the policy and the regulatory reform is very difficult. So it requires a lot of patience, time, and effort. And I think I cannot emphasize this more. But that's the lesson from GMS. It's clearly written in the strategy. And the second one is that the fourth one is that policy and the regulation won't work automatically. You need to address the issue about your institutional capacity. If there's a gap, the situation is similar to the case without any regulatory reforms. So institutional gaps. And the fifth one is that you have to set activity output target and the timeline realistically, because if the action plan or the roadmap is too over ambitious, then you create an unnecessary expectation. Then when something gets disappointed, then the member lose the momentum and the whole thing just won't work. Okay, so that's another lesson highlighted. And the next one, because of this wide disparity, so the national and the sub-regional focal points has to make sure everything is harmonized, has been well discussed. Otherwise, it's easy to end up with the situation which is lack of focus, duplication, and inconsistency. So pay attention to the disparity. And the last one is that you have to build a mutually acceptable cost and a benefit sharing mechanism. I think last week, Duncan from DFID also mentioned the issues about everything you have strong players and weak players. Then you have to find out the mutually acceptable mechanism to share the cost and to share the benefit. That's sometimes the issue is not only about how we generate the value, it's how we allocate and distribute value. So that's what makes the project feasible and also bankable. Okay, so that's the two specific country mentioned in the strategy is that Laos and Cambodia are relatively weaker in terms of population and economic strength, and when compared to their two neighboring countries. So how to find a mechanism that's acceptable for all of the parties is crucial. So that's the lesson highlighted in the Transport Strategy 2030 for GMS. Okay, so next. I probably spent too much time for this. So for SASEC, I think this SASEC operational plan is just updated, and it has a lot of project about connectivity, physical connectivity for roads on the left and for railways on the right. So I think those projects will continue to be implemented to have better connectivity. Okay, yeah, but next one. There are several new initiatives proposed to be explored in the Success Action Plan 2020 to 2022. That's a relatively short-term planning, and you might have noticed that the multimodal connectivity, maritime connectivity, border infrastructure, e-commerce. I'm not sure what the situation in South Asia about cross-border e-commerce, but for the case in Taiwan, that we do have a lot of cross-border e-commerce activities. So how to facilitate the trade facilitation for e-commerce and tourism and the supply chain, as Ambassador Kerry mentioned, that Bangladesh has been heavily depends on government exporting. So how to make sure the supply chain is resilient. That's also it's a national security issue, I think, and how to leverage the technology at the new normal. So these are the new initiative. I think that's the new direction which deserved more discussion. So that's in the action plan of SASEC. Okay, so the next one, please. Okay, and for SASEC, the ADB has been working on a STFSF, SASEC Trade Facilitation Strategic Framework. Based on this strategic framework, ADB has been highlighted 5 priority areas, all related to trade facilitation. I would like to particularly highlight cross-border facility improvement and through transportation facilitations. For the through transport facilitations that we have some initiative about electronic cargo tracking system, the BBIN motor vehicle agreement, and also there's a pilot about India, Myanmar, Thailand motor vehicle agreement, and the ADB has been involved in drafting the protocols, and and certainly that's a very important issue for trade facilitation. And for cross-border facility, we have a lot of road connectivity project that continue to increase the physical connectivity. But also we have a new project, the concept has been approved. It's called Success Integrated Trade Facility Sector Development Project. So it's not only about hardware, it's about the development of the whole sectors. So there's a lot of very comprehensive
It seems there are some technical issues on Quencheng's end. Maybe we can wait for half a minute, maybe a minute. In the meanwhile, let me highlight a very important point that Ambassador Karim has made about this revival of the old linkages. You see, not just waterways, but also if we can revive some of the old railway linkages, then I think it is going to do wonder. In today's economic times, there is a story about India-Bangladesh road linkages. No, why did you remove the presentation? So that's something. Is Quencheng, is he there? Hello, Prashant?
No, sir, he is not there. So he seems to have disconnected.
Yeah. So can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, this is, I mean, we have come towards the end of his presentation, and let me now take it over since he got disconnected. And these are some of the challenges that we always face while having dependent too much on technologies. So SASEC is currently developing a much more comprehensive transport planning model. It's not just limited to a particular region, but covering all 3 regions, Central Asia, South Asia, and GFS. Now, here comes the importance of our project. While this is going to be very much of a technical work, what we intend to do is to understand the political economy aspects of all these connectivity initiatives, how people on the ground are thinking about them, who could be the winners, and more importantly, who are likely to be the losers, and how can we take their concerns into account and think about alternate income livelihood opportunities in order to take them on board, so that on the ground there is not much backlash against such initiatives. So that is one major objective of our project, and for that to happen we need to have a well-informed political economic discourse, and this modeling exercise is then going to be very, very useful for us, because it's not just transport modeling. So what ADB is intended to do is also to understand the impact of all these initiatives on the ground in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of better price realization, and things like that. Next slide, please. So this is the traffic analysis zones that they're going to take up, and you can see that no, Quancheng has sent a message that is having some technical issues. So let me take forward this presentation, and if we look at it very, very carefully, it will not be much of a difficulty to have seamless connectivity between Central Asia and Southeast Asia through South Asia. But where is the difficulty? That's a $1 million question. And that's, as Ambassador Karim has rightly underlined, the political will. So how are we going to generate better political will? And we have a number of very good speakers who are going to talk about this. So that is something which we need to, one major factor, I would say, for generating better political will is to go to the ground and see how ground level stakeholders are thinking about these initiatives, what kind of benefits that they are perceiving, what kind of challenges that they are perceiving, and then take those inputs back to the policy making process, back to the drawing board, so that we can take into account the ground level political economy aspects of connectivity and trade. Next, please. So that was the last slide. And once again, let me thank Mr. Quancheng Wang for not just for his presentation, but for becoming a very active participant in this project, in our project, as an advisor, as a knowledge partner. And through him, we have reached out to various important stakeholders, not just in South Asia or in BBIN countries, but also in Central Asia and Southeast Asia, particularly the GMS region. So with that, we have come to an end to this presentation, and I hope that Quancheng can join us as soon as possible. But over to Ambassador Karim for conducting this panel discussion. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Vipul. My task here is not to intervene myself, but to manage the time. So we have roughly I think we have 5 speakers more. And shall I say each speaker please take about 12 minutes?
Maybe 8 to 10 minutes, so that we can have some more time for discussion.
I was being overly generous. 8 to 10 minutes. And then we can have a second round with even the speakers interacting with each other if they have questions. So let's start with the first speaker. Where's the list?
Professor Rahman, Mustafiz Bhai.
Dr. Mustafizur Rahman, my old comrade in arms and friend. You have the
Thank you, sir. It's an honor to speak at a session which is being chaired by you. and your initial remarks were very insightful, and I will draw upon those when I share my views. And distinguished panelists, fellow panelists, we have had the already the advantage of hearing from Mr. Huang, the cross-country lessons and what are the learnings for BBIN sub-region as we go forward. I think Ambassador Karim has put the political economy aspects very clearly and very insightfully. And Mr. Huang has mentioned about the lessons that we can draw from CAREC, GMS, and SASEC. When I look at BBIN sub-region, the first thing that comes to my mind is that 3 of these 4 countries are least developed countries, which are going to graduate by 2024. So the whole scenario of competitiveness will be changing. And if we cannot really calibrate our economies to these changing scenarios, we will be in for a lot of challenges. The LDC status have given these 3 countries, and my country, Bangladesh, included, zero tariff access to almost all the countries, even to the markets of India, almost for all products in China, not to speak of the developed countries. Now, when we graduate, obviously the duty-free, quota-free will not be there. So how do you translate under those circumstances your comparative advantages into competitive advantage? And there, I think that transport connectivity comes in a very big way as a central element to translate your comparative advantage into competitive advantage. So in my small brief presentation, I will use 3 words: transformation, coordination, and sequencing. Now, by transformation, I mean that, you see, we are talking about BBIN motor vehicle agreement, but it is just a transport agreement. So we will have to translate this transport corridor into economic corridor. And for that, we need connectivities in other areas: trade connectivity, investment connectivity, logistics connectivity, people-to-people connectivity. So in order to transform the transport corridor, which will require a lot of investment. So in order to have the gains which Bipul was mentioning, and this project is also aiming at exploring, we will have to have the other connectivities. So I think that, for example, in Bangladesh, we are building the special economic zones. We have dedicated Indian special economic zones as well. So if we have the connectivities and we have the investments coming, taking advantage of those connectivities so that we have lower lead time, we have lower transport costs, and we can then access the Indian market, taking advantage of the market access that India has given, taking advantage of the investment that will be coming. So I think that investment connectivity will be key to translating the transport corridor into economic corridor. Then you have, as Ambassador Karim has also mentioned, you have to have the transport facilitation. So all these will have to come together. So I look at it as a part of a value chain. Transport corridor is part of a value chain where the other parts, the other connectivities will also have to be there. So that's why the transformation issue comes in. And for that, we need coordination. As Ambassador Karim has also mentioned, across the borders, we had a seamless connectivity many years back, but now our borders are not crossing points. They are choking points, they are control points. Now, if we have the motor vehicle agreement, we will have to have coordination on both sides of the border. We will need electronic data exchange. We will need platforms that are coordinated. We'll need single windows, which Mr. Huang also mentioned. So I think that logistics and trade facilitation will become very important. And from that perspective, coordination is so important. Let us remember why the SAARC motor vehicle agreement could not be signed. One of the major issue was how you will resolve the disputes. So the dispute settlement mechanism was not, developed, and that's how we had some differences of opinion, and then we had this BBIN motor vehicle instead of the SARC motor vehicle. So coordination in terms of developing the institutions, which Mr. Huang very rightly mentioned. What will be the institutional architecture? How they will be coordinated? What will be the dispute settlement mechanism? So I think that these coordinations are also very important. Then the third point is the sequencing. Ambassador Karim mentioned very rightly that it is not just transport connectivity, it is multimodal transport connectivity. And there comes, the coordination. We have talked about the waterways, we have talked about railways, people mentioned about railways, and then obviously the road connectivity. But you see, for example, we have given India connectivity through Bangladesh to Northeast, but we have the waterways, but in the Ashuganj, we were supposed to build the Ashuganj International River Port. So since these were not well sequenced and we didn't build the river port, international river port, we see that over the last 5 years, even after signing of the connectivity agreement, only a few transports have gone through Ashuganj, and we see that there is no customs over there, there is no warehousing facilities over there, so you don't have the connectivity. So I think that sequencing is also very important. What after what? So, and some of the things you will have to do parallelly. So we cannot wait that we will have the corridors identified, and then we will have the international river port at Ashuganj, and then we will see what happens. But so these things will have to be very, very well sequenced. If we are building for example, the special economic zones in Chittagong, where the India will also have its own country-specific economic zones. It's good that now we are thinking about using the third Indian line of credit of about $150 million from there out of the $4.5 billion to develop the Indian country-specific special economic zone within the Mireshwarai broader special economic zone. So I think that these sequencing are also very important. Some of the other issues, like for example, cabotage. When the transports will come, will they be able to take back also goods? So I was looking at some of the provisions in the BBIN BBIN motor vehicle agreement and some of the standard operating protocols. There are also some gray areas, how the transport which comes, how they will go back with what type of cargo, and there are cabotage limitations. So one will have to develop, trust, number one, and number two, also joint venture, perhaps transport companies, so that these issues are also resolved. So I would say that in my submission, that motor vehicle agreement is good, it's necessary, but it is not sufficient, as we have seen from Mr. Huang's presentation as well, and as was also mentioned by Ambassador Tariq. So I think that the project that Bipul is now steering, and the M Connect, and I'm very fortunate to be also associated with that. They will look at it. Bipul mentioned about what are the perceptions about benefits and challenges, what are the risks and rewards. Risk and reward perception will depend on how we can really disseminate what are the benefits, what we are doing parallelly, just not building roads. For example, BBIN, we have identified 30 corridors. We'll have to have prioritized maybe 5 or 6, and we have estimated that about $8 billion will be needed. So people will have to understand that there will be benefits originating from these huge investments. We will have to borrow money, organize finances, perhaps also think about innovative instruments like bonds or something, so to mobilize the funds. But these will have costs. So we will have to really ensure the people that there will be benefits from this. And the political buy-in will also to that extent depend if we can show that there are these benefits. And my final submission is that those benefits will be realized if we can really prove that it will be transformative, that it will be well coordinated. There will be institutional mechanisms to support it, and it will be well sequenced so that we can really translate these potential benefits into realized benefits. So I think this is very important. And I'm hoping that through this project, we will be able to bring out these multi-dimensional features of the motor vehicle agreement, that it is just not a transport agreement, that it is part of a broader economic sub-regional economic cooperation, which we are trying to build here. And if we can do that, I think that there will be political buy-in, and also buy-in most of all from the citizens of our sub-region. Thank you, Ambassador Karim, for giving me the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mustafiz. You've spoken the words from my heart when you identified those three areas. When I set out on my journey to try and reformat Bangladesh-India relations, reset, I had identified three ways to go forward. And I think that is what we have to come back to. A, what are the priorities? Now you can have 10, 15, 100 priorities. But if you attack the wrong priority first, you will not be able to go from number one to number two. The sequencing of the priorities is more important than the priorities themselves sometimes. And that you go forward, if you have a body, if 2 persons are going to cooperate, or 3 persons are going to cooperate, they have to have someone coordinating it. We achieved a lot of things between 2010 and 2012. Why? Because we had bilaterally set up a coordination body at the highest level, because that is how it works in our part of the world. Okay. As long as that worked, we would find out where the problems were, that body would convene, and the bottlenecks would be removed. That fizzled out after 2012. And I see that as the biggest danger that we pose to ourselves. Everything else slowed down. And you mentioned one two important points, which people also mention: trust. Political economy is a balancing between the political forces and the economic desires. What keeps the equilibrium is how much trust you can bring in the middle to hold it together. These are two horses which will go in different ways unless the coachman is experienced to build that trust. And what I see is people mention going to the ground and talking. Are we doing enough talking? Are we listening to what the people on the ground are saying? How do political leaders react to what they do or do not do? They basically keep their ears to the ground. And if they do something, they do it because that will satisfy the people. If they slow down, they do it because they are afraid of backlash. I see that now endangered. So with those, let me pass on. I think we passed over Sri Radha Datta. She was supposed to be, Sri Radha is again a very old friend, again an old comrade with whom I have worked in many fora. And she is now at the center where I was nested for 3 years, Vivekananda. Sri Radha, you have the floor. 8 to 10 minutes, please. Unmute.
Unmuted, okay. Thank you, sir. Such a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Vipul, and a warm greeting to all my co-panelists. It's been a learning process listening to all of you, and I'm hoping not to repeat some of the stuff which I think there's overlap, but let me just say the way I can. to begin with, I mean, my basic premise here is that I begin with the idea that the sub-region is a political constructed space. And, political actors are always going to perceive and interpret the idea of a region differently. There's going to be variance, and I think we'll have to accept that and move with it. And the idea of sub-region, of course, has been far more cohesive, and that was the idea. I mean, I think when we saw that SARC didn't figure out the way we wanted it to be, sub-region was obviously the alternate choice for us. But the challenges still remain, and it is because of the word that has been used very often, the political will and issues. But there are very, very layered issues within even the small subgroup. So I think losing sight of that is not going to help us improve the conditions both at the governmental level as well as the ground level. My second underlying thought, the more I study the region, the more I internalize that the idea of cooperation is actually a much belated idea. It's actually the idea of competition which has remained very instinctive in the region. I mean, we've struggled for the last 70 years, and the notions of national sovereignty, identity, which remains implicit in the way the region functions and thinks. And that again underlines many of the initiative, and I know the kind of efforts that Ambassador Karim has put in, and many of the other thought leaders in the region has. But I'm saying the idea of cooperation is really, really very nascent. And which is the reason I think the struggle, the delays, all these gaps in terms of implementation actually occurs because, I mean, somewhere there is always, that we keep talking about the, trust deficit, but it's always questioning as to why, what is it in for me? And there's always seems a lack of clarity, when most of these projects are discussed. I mean, for many years, and I know many of us working on this, and I've often complained about the lack of progress, and I'm taking BBIN as a case here, that it was signed, it was decided, and I still remember 2014, it was in Nepal, Kathmandu, one of the, conferences where this was discussed. And even there, I remember the, representative from Bhutan had actually, he was hesitant. He had flagged issues of environment and other things, but none of us had actually taken into cognition. I mean, we just thought it's one of those issues, we'll overcome it. And, that's something which, has stayed with me. And I think, this whole shaky, unsure situation in South Asia plays a very, very, kind of a strong role in the way. But I still, I mean, having said that, we for very long been complaining about the lack of progress, I actually think given the underlying issues of the region, so where we have reached now is actually quite an accomplishment. I mean, I know I'm changing my own words, and I think the framework is in place now. It's taken a long time. The framework is in place, but there are, several issues again. So we need to look at that. What I would actually think is that why don't I look at BBIN and see the lessons within the issue and see how we can actually learn from that. And I think the most of it here is, while of course there are many, and I think Huang's presentation was fabulous about the, the other cooperative endeavors which are taking place all over, supported by ADB. But I think for us, South Asia is a different, trajectory altogether. I mean, the templates are very different. While we, of course, have many examples in ASEAN and otherwise how conflictual situation and hostility at times, but they've all worked together. But again, I think in South Asia, as I said, the issues of identity and national sovereignty is so deeply entrenched that I'm not sure that we can always, do a like-to-like comparison. But I think the lessons within BBIN actually I find is far more if we can actually learn from that. I mean, the first, of course, as I said, that cooperation is not an inherent issue in the sub-region. It has a very top-down approach. It's always been from there. And, the problem here is that, when we've seen, and we've seen that in many of our states, where issues like religion and other things, when it's just sheer politics, top-down approach has often been effective. I mean, Bangladesh is a case in point, India is a case in point. But when we are discussing political economy, then I think it's not strictly possible, because then the ground issues, commercial issues, the market economy, all that plays a very strong role. So even when there is, I mean, while when all the discussions were on about the sub-regional, I think by and large, all the governments agreed. I mean, I don't think there was any dissonance about that. Some little issues here and there, and as I said, Bhutan had always raised the issue. And I remember this 2014, they had raised the issue. And subsequently, we've seen how it is right now, we're just going back and forth again with the signing of the MOU. But I think what has happened is while the governments have been at large, the ground reality, the ground dynamics have not complemented the process. And that is actually a telling of the lack of homework. In many projects that you look at outside the region, we've seen the homework is done before, much ahead. There's a very clear, kind of a roadmap ahead, and then we come back to the drawing board here. Here, there was a political decision. Okay, yes, let's do this. We think it's good for the region. But then, as I think pointed out brilliantly by Ambassador Karim as always, down below, I don't think we had a feel of the ground. And I also, at this point, I want to recall a statement a couple of months ago. There was a FICCI meeting about on BIMSTEC. I'm not sure what Ambassador Karim was here, but some of our we all speakers on that. And I remember the Thai ambassador, this of course BIMSTEC that he said. And we all know BIMSTEC is 2 decades old and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And he says, just wait for the ground to get ready. He says, why are we rushing it? Let's wait. And India was pushing it for political reasons and elsewhere. But that stayed with me, that if the ground is not ready, no matter how top down the whole approach is, it's impossible to take start the process and have a momentum build. I think in many of this, in SAARC and sub-regional initiatives, the centrality of India plays a critical role. And I say it with a heavy heart that India often has not been very inspiring. Because, the way when I have these, while I said the governments are agreeable, most of us, when we meet on the table, we realize that the merits of cooperation. But again, when we have these individual conversations with our colleagues in South Asia, there is always a question. Especially, and let me flag the BBIN here. The whole point, and again, many of our colleagues all over the South Asia region has pointed this to me, that what is it for us? The whole larger matrix looks as if, India is going to get transit, India is going to move the thing. If you look at the cargo load, the most of it is actually from India to elsewhere. So can I say the same thing is going to come back to India? Is the traffic, it's not a mutually, as of now, a very complete traffic. And I think that is something, there's a lot of, I think, and I know Nepal has, of course, been one of the front runners in, the trial runs and all of that. But again, I think there is a kind of a mindset which constantly tells them that here, India being the, central government, not only pushing it, but again, the whole benefits. And I think the point here was raised by somebody about the cost and the benefits. There is little clarity. And I think everybody, and I'm not sure whether, I think there's ever been any frankness in, discussing this, but somehow there's an understanding, a kind of a, feeling that it's the whole thing works in favor of India, which is necessarily not true. I think the economics would say. But I think, again, the point here is that the lack of market force in this process is something that we need to probably give it a thought. Let me just give you this example. During COVID, West Bengal had closed the land border, right, for, issues of transfer of infection. The coastal shipping line, which India-Bangladesh has never really been popular, but the same traffic actually moved through that. It's a fact that we've been trying the inland water trays, and of course, the recent agreement, which is going to be through, Tripura side, is something that we've all written about, discussed, and we think it's a very, very positive environment. But we also know the inland water transfer system, the coastal shipping agreement between India and Bangladesh has been hardly used. And there's so much more that happens but when this actually happened during the COVID, there were weeks when actually large shipment and cargo movement took place on the coast. So I'm saying, when there is a market demand, people find ways to do it. So right now, the fact that we see that there is very little movement also tells you that maybe the ground forces is not ready for this, while the governments certainly agree, but I think the ground is not ready. And we've also not done enough, the point that we did, that have we spoken enough on the ground? And I think on a project that people knows, I was discussing on the Northeast, where I'm discussing cross-border connectivity again with our neighbors. While the political leaders are, at a certain level and on the same page, the ground situation literally, in hubs of kilometers change. And I don't think that has been factored in when we are discussing these multimodal transport systems. Also, I think what we've seen through the BBIN is that the the bureaucrat, I mean, we've said this, many of us ad nauseum about the role of bureaucracy, how it always kind of, but what we've seen here in BBIN specifically is a lack of clarity. We've gone back and forth between passenger cargo, now only cargo. So redraw your, agreements all over again. Bhutan, of course, was not a surprise element, but India would like to believe it was. It certainly wasn't. I'm saying they've said it for very long that they were not going to be, they were hesitant. They had their apprehensions. But somehow I don't think there was very little. The whole idea was, yes, guys, we agree. The political leaders agreed. Let's push through. But it's certainly not possible if you don't think through the steps. And I think clearly from 2015 to 2020 sitting now, I think we look back, and if we could have learned the lessons from BBIN, we would probably, gone ahead. My other problem here again with the government is the messaging is always a problem in the region. When we signed, and I remember 2014 or 2015 when the whole thing was signed in Thimphu, the kind of op-eds that every newspaper spoke, as if, we were going to have a trucks move in within months. I mean, in fact, I'm not too sure, but there was also actually a 6 months window being given by somebody, and I'm not sure which country did that. But I'm saying that whole thing is so unrealistic, which makes people, we build these maps thinking that we've just signed an agreement. There's so much more to be done. I mean, we keep talking about God being in details, but the fact that we had to discuss hardened infrastructure, again, the point's been raised very well by Huang also. And then that has to be backed by soft infrastructure. And again, in India, we do not believe that these are parallel processes. We've seen that at the border. We've seen so many of our border developments, like Sutarkhandi, for example, is just sitting idle because we've not thought through. While some of the worst borders, which is Benapole, Petropol, carries the weight, because again, we don't put in enough thoughts and ideas in terms of the border protocol, the standardizations, the local imperatives. And again, something that's again been discussed here is, how these decisions often seem ad hoc, they're not coordinated, and they do not dovetail. I mean, when you're discussing multimodal, and I think, a kind of article of faith for me always in the region is that we must leave the roads for passenger movement and look at the rails and look at the water for cargo. I think that's ideally what we're looking at. But we are just not preparing ourselves for that. I mean, we constantly go back and forth. We do one, some jetties still unprepared, some, roads are still not connected. This whole thing of where we have not been able to think through is something which I think is constantly keeping us behind. And I don't know, and I think people would know this better, that, while, for example, when you're putting the BBIN in place, there are a plethora of organizations which are required, right? Foreign Ministry, Home Ministry, Commerce, the Transport Ministry. I mean, there are several points. I mean, I'm just talking about India and our own border linkages with others. Every government, I think, has to go through these several issues. There is never, why is it not possible to have a dedicated organization, just two-man army, to actually pursue this individually and, remain at core of this whole pursuit of this particular thing. Every time we've seen it's one particular industry is being, one particular ministry being represented, they're going ahead with the work, but I haven't seen any one person or one organization try and coordinate that. Largely the foreign minister is in charge, but again, that's really not a strong point, and I think many of us are aware of that. I think there has to be some dedicated structures in place, whether it's BBIN, whether it's sub-regional, whatever it is, in South Asia, where we have a usual, how shall I say, a lethargy. I think implementation is a problem not only for India, but many of our neighbors too. And there's lack of coordination between the governments, despite the fact that Bangladesh and India are, I think, at the, at presently have a partnership which has never been seen before. But even then, the coordination in terms of building these standardizations is still, leaves a lot to be desired. So, I mean, when we are discussing multimodal, obviously there's a huge, stakeholders involved. But again, we've seen that it's always the government stakeholders who kind of, push the issue. The non-government stakeholders, the commercial, the market, they are never, I mean, they are there, I mean, a discussion at some level, but never in a decision-making process. They are also very, very reticent to, spearhead issues. And I think that's where, I think CUTS and ADB comes in very, very strongly, because you need somebody to push that. And it's often, it's simply not possible. I mean, there's an inherent structural flaw when you think that only a government can push an issue. There's various numbers of stakeholders on the ground. that we need to, kind of put them together on the same page, put them in a cohesive manner. And I think the word that Mustafa's wife said, coordination, is something that we certainly lack in the region and which is not enough. Let me conclude by saying that I'm going to say this is, I agree the process has been delayed and I've changed my mind. While, I think there has been enough of the problem in the past. We've seen, and then political issues, again, is really the one which rides the whole thing. While most leaders would say, yes, we agree, yes, we agree, but when they go back home, we've seen how difficult it has been to even get a signature on a single page. And I think Ambassador Karim knows that better than anybody else, that despite everybody agreeing in a room saying yes, but when they go back home, there are so many impediments that's come in the way. When we are discussing sitting in the middle of pandemic, I really don't know how much the structures are going to be affected. I mean, there's a severe funding issue now in our country, and I'm not talking about anybody else, but I know in India, there's going to be severe, we are, again, I think Huang mentioned about e-commerce. Indian e-commerce is very, very limited. At the borders, it doesn't exist. I've visited all the borders very well, whether it's on the Manipur, Mizoram, Myanmar side, the Bangladesh side often. E-commerce is not something that they're able to do business with. And I know we have to change. I mean, who knew that I was going to be sitting at home and doing these presentations? But life has changed. And there is more, again, individual change and a governmental structure changing takes a lot in our region. And I think we will have to, I mean, there is going to be certain different ways of how, COVID has changed our ways. But let me close in by saying here that right now, the point to rejoice here is that a framework exists. But what happens with the framework? How do we work with this? We need to generate commercial market interest. I think that has not been done enough. The ground situation is something, again, for every nation in BBIN, it's different. So again, that coordination there, again, I mean, it doesn't have to be a government structure who does that actually. Many of us working on the region can actually provide very valid, on the ground dynamic input, which actually will take this forward. So, I mean, it's delayed, but my only hope is that if I can take the BBIN experience and say that what are the lessons that we've learned, imbibe them, maybe, and even at this point of time, I'm also looking at regional value chain, which I think this region, again, we've discussed how it's barely integrated. But if in this COVID time, we've realized how global value chain has been disrupted, how it's affected, and I think the point about government industry, point of many of our industries has been very, very deeply affected. If we can develop regional value chain, coordinate that with the kind of seamless transport system that we're discussing, I think that would have been a step forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Srirada. I couldn't agree more. A lot of things that you have said, and you know my thoughts better than I do, in a sense. One of the things which was pointed out earlier is that where does the resistance to a project comes? Sometimes it's not the project that is being resisted. It's something very extraneous that comes and impacts on what you're trying to do in the project. That's what happened in the BBIN MVA. That's what happened in our almost reaching to signing the Tri-Nation Agreement on Power Generation and Sharing between Bhutan, Bangladesh, and India. And what doesn't happen in one tends to negatively impact efforts that we are making on other fields. We are trying to do it with Nepal, but then now people are saying, if we can do it there, you sure we can do it here? Then you mentioned about the ground level resistance that comes from bureaucrats and others. There are numerous players in on the ground. And as a former bureaucrat, I know how disjointed the administrations can be. Tough battles, ego battles, everything coming in, one tripping the other. That is why that coordination body was necessary at the Prime Minister's office level. Now, it's not possible to do it always, but for projects like this, we have to devise something. I kept saying that 2012 onwards, we need that, we need that, we need that. And I knew things were slipping. My fear is, and it'll be a huge tragedy if that happens, that just as SAARC didn't move, and as the Thai ambassador complained, I was not there, but I can very much empathize. I warned about this. BIMSTEC, India was in haste in order to operationalize this Act East from Look East. And it sort of neglected paying closer attention that BBIN, where what has been identified and doable needs to be done. Let's not forget that 4 members of BIMSTEC are BBIN out of the 7 members. If the other 3 cannot see the 4 doing something, why do you think they are going to be interested in taking anything forward? Okay, we have signed an agreement, governments will meet, governments will wine and dine, we'll go forward. So messaging, if you want to win over the man on the ground, the common person where roads are going to go through, you have to tell him, this is how you're going to benefit. Is that happening? I don't see that happening. I have not seen that happening in the last 10 years. Okay. We are talking to the gallery. This is already a converted gallery. Okay. We need to convert other people. Okay, let me go to the next speaker. Again, I would request, because we are almost reaching the end of our time, Mr. Yubak Dangol from Nepal. 8 minutes, maybe, if you could try. And I will have to quietly slip away in about 8 minutes time. So I listen to Mr. Dangol because I have to go to another web meeting. I have to be there a few minutes before 5:30. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karim. As in the case of Nepal, I will explain in brief only, because the case of Nepal is a landlocked country, but it has been changed into the land-linked country, as the transit access through the neighboring countries from India, and our boundaries is India and China. But all the trade, most of the trades has been from the India side. So in the cost and benefit of transition in general, we have the current of good competitive in international market. Currently, Nepal is working to diversify its transit routes in terms of destination and in terms of means. So in the case of transit, we speak in via ICD and ICP. In Nepal, there are 5 ICDs that are in Bhairava, Birganj, Viratnagar, and Kakarvita at the southern part of Nepal, and Tatapani is at the northern part of Nepal, which is linked by China. Besides these, ICP integrated checkpost, it is at Birganj, which was operated from April of 2018, and Viratnagar ICP operated from February 2020. It is recently in operation. Similarly, Kathmandu ICDS and CFS is in under construction, which is the central part of the city. It's in capital of Nepal. So other ICPs such as Bhairava and Nepalganj are proposed for the construction. India and Nepal have signed as a transit treaty as well as railway service agreement for the smooth flow of the bilateral as well as transit cargoes to and from Kolkata and Visakhapatnam port. Similarly, we are adopting transshipment procedure for the rail movement to and from Kolkata as well as Visakhapatnam. Presently, only Birganj ICD is assessed through the rail link with India. Sooner, Viratnagar ICP will also rail link with India. For Nepal, the nearest seaport is Kolkata port in India, whereas other seaport of BIMSTEC countries are far from the capital city, Kathmandu. However, our land route transits attached with India from east, west, and southern part of the country, and passing only 13 kilometers southeast from Kakarvita ICD, via we can reach to Bangladesh. In the past, Nepal and Bangladesh concluded different transit agreement back in 1976. This agreement provides facilities, movement, traffic transit of Nepal and Bangladesh, and vice versa. The entry and exit points allowed under the agreement for the movement of traffic in transit are Mongala Port, Chittagong Port, Bairol, Bangalaband, Chilaiti, and Benapol. Among these 6 ports of Bangladesh, 2 of them seaports, remaining are dry ports. Currently, I think Fulbari Banglabad route, Rohanpur Singhabad route, and Radhikapur Bairol routes has been given Nepal by India to reach Bangladesh, which is the best for multimodal connectivity in BBIN sector. So as per different, our speaker, Sri Radha told that there is a letter of exchange between the India and West Airways as well in 2014. There was a rail transit route as well as road transit via Kakarbitta Banglaban corridor. In recent past, agreement has been reached in proposal to apply Nepalese flagship, which is inland waterways, that the landlocked country is not a landlocked country in Nepal. It is the land-linked country, such that the link is with road link, rail links, and as well as with the waterway, inland waterways link from India, that is via Kolkata, Kulaghat, Banaras, and Sahibganj. Similarly, again, the rail link is also as per our rail for service agreement, which is in connection as well. Then significant progress has been achieved to use Rohanpur, Singhabad, and Radhikapur Viral route, which is the road link via to the Bangladesh. I think these are the milestone achieved for Nepal, which will ensure free flow Nepali goods to neighboring countries. And this BBIN, SAARC, BIMSTEC, and all the countries are such gathered so that trade and transit are fairly done. So the landing is fair for us in our countries such as Nepal. Well, time is up. Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Yubak. Ambassador Karim has to go to another meeting, as he said. So let me take over. Let me now invite Julian. Julian from Marx Group. He's the largest shipping group in the world. Julian, I have two specific questions for you, and I'll be grateful if you can address them pointedly and briefly as possible. First is that this is what we have experienced from our work, that private sector somehow is not that interested on regional cooperation in South Asia and BBI in particular. Secondly, how important you think is the multimodal connectivity, particularly the connectivity through waterways? So over to you, Julian.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for giving me the privilege of being part of this discussion. I'm very honored to be part of such an eminent group of experts. I feel rather daunted being just a humble shipping person. I think probably, apart from one observation, I'll scrap some of the stuff that I was going to say in the interest of time. But the one observation I will make before I answer your question is that I must compliment CUTS and the other organizations who are involved in this, setting up this dialogue, for having done so. Because in the time that I have spent in South Asia, it's very obvious that there simply isn't enough thoughtful discussion about logistics and multimodal transport. What one sees time and time again is the industry talking to itself, either in sort of self-adulation or blaming one another about why things aren't working. We really do need, if any of the projects that we're talking about are going to work, to see a much higher standard of debate and a much higher standard of discussion with academia, with government and other institutions, if all this stuff is going to work. So many of the problems that have been talked about by previous speakers and with such eloquence and in so articulate a manner are, I believe, arise because we have not managed to align people's expectations and ideas. Everybody talks from their own corner, but they simply fail to make the intellectual effort to bridge gaps. So I think that a seminar, webinar, call it what you like this, is very important. You asked two things. One, why is the public sector apparently not interested in regional traffic? And secondly, you asked how important is all this to intermodal operators such as ourselves? Well, the quick answer to the former is that we'd love to be involved in regional traffic because it will help us in all sorts of ways. I mean, it's interesting if you compare the way Maersk operates in other parts of the world to South Asia. If you look at our operations in Asia, in Europe, in the Americas, everywhere we have regional container carrier setups. Do we have one in South Asia? Answer, no, we do not. We'd love to, but there isn't the business there in the way that makes it worthwhile. And there are so many barriers in the way of it that it's not worth it. So all our operations go in and out of Bangladesh down to Singapore or somewhere in Malaysia or to Colombo, when really so much of that traffic ought to be hubbed in an Indian port or somewhere like that. But it doesn't happen. And the reason it doesn't happen, put very simply, is that there are simply far too many regulatory obstacles in the way of it. So we're keen, we'd love to do it, but it's frankly very difficult. And I think in saying that, what I'm not trying to do is blame someone else. It's a collective responsibility. And I think industry as a whole needs to pick up that challenge and try and work together arm in arm with government and other regulators to deal with those issues, to try and deliver a set of logistics services that really will meet the real demands of the marketplace. Your second question, I think, was how important is intermodal transport? I mean, it's impossible. I think that's the question. Correct me if I'm wrong. The answer is it's hugely important because, put very simply, if one brings cargo from Nepal or Bhutan or I don't know the states of the Northeast simply to the port, which is 1,000 miles away, and you do not have adequate ability to move that cargo inland, then you're not delivering the right economic transport service. So facilitating intermodal transport is enormously important. And it's only in the last 10, 15 years maximum that people in this part of the world have really started to think about it. I know when I first came to South Asia, nobody really thought beyond the ports. The idea of moving cargo in containers inland as part of a through movement, the exception was Delhi, but there was a reasonably reliable railway line. Elsewhere, the focus was entirely on the ports. And it's only recently that the infrastructure, both physical and legislative, be it in one particular country or across border, has even begun to be developed. It's terribly important to deliver that service because if you can't deliver the service to the door as part of one service with one piece of paper covering it, then you're not delivering the product that the market wants. So it's hugely important, and we have to work together to deal with the obstacles that are in the way of that. Does that answer your question, sir?
Thank you, Julian. I mean, on some of this point, I think it will be better for us to have a one-to-one discussion with you, particularly on regulatory issues, and how to reduce some of this regulatory burden. Maybe some of them are necessary, some others may not be necessary. So we're going to have that as we make progress in this project. So now let's come to Constantino Xavier, Tino, as he is known as, who's from Brookings, India. After hearing all this, I have a couple of questions or issues for you to raise. One is, of course, you have been implementing a project called Samban, which is again on connectivity, but much more from, may not be that much from technical point of view, but more from political point of view. From there, how do you see the alignment between the work that you are doing and the work that we are? That's number one. And secondly, is it right in saying that sometimes we are in too much of a hurry? By we mean India, the largest economy in this region. Is it right to say that sometimes we are in too much of a hurry and then we tend to lose interest? So do you think there is a correct description? And how do you see all these initiatives? How are they aligned with our neighborhood first policy or Act East policy? Over to you, Tino, and with a request as briefly as possible. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you, Bipul. Congratulations for this project. Really interesting, timely, relevant, focused on a particular aspect of the region and on a particular form of connectivity. And thank you for having me here today. Within the 8 minutes, Bipul, what I'll do very quickly is respond to your first question, which I think we should all have an obvious answer for, all of us engaged in connectivity, regional issues. So at this project we started, the Samband Regional Connectivity Initiative at Brookings, India, is really not reinventing the wheel, but what we're doing and complementing many other initiatives, all of us, I think, are expand the debate on connectivity towards new stakeholders. So this has been traditionally often a political debate, a security discussion, a diplomatic discussion, and I think we all agree that the time has come that we need to push this into very different directions. Not only different constituencies within the government, I think Sri Radha mentioned it, different stakeholders beyond government, different levels of government, also central, state, local, etc. But on BBIN, I really want to focus my comments on BBIN, on the work we've been doing, and highlight a few issues on your second question on how to take this forward. And 4 quick propositions on how we've come to this point. I mean, one, BBIN really is not new. And I think not only in the sense that Ambassador Tariq Karim was mentioning that it started in the 1990s, the discourse about these 4 countries having sub-regional cooperation. I would risk saying actually that the habits of cooperation in the BBIN region or the sub-regional habits of cooperation existed in the 1950s and 60s. And in many ways, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. For example, on health cooperation, some of the work we're doing now, we're finding tremendous habits of cooperation among clusters of 2 and 3 countries across South Asia that worked on eradication of malaria, for example, under CEARO, the WHO. So there's many forms of connectivity, and I think there's certainly a history to BBIN. Whether it's in the SAARC Charter 7 article, whether it is in the South Asia Growth Quadrangle, but certainly there's a history on which we can build, and most importantly, the India-Bangladesh 2009 to 2007 initiative. Second, BBIN is not unique. Again, we don't need to reinvent the wheel because, a simple example like the Danube River Commission in the River Danube in Europe was created in the mid-late 19th century and then formalized in 1948. And it regulates navigation on one of the most important river arteries of Europe. And therefore, BBIN is not unique, it's not new, and therefore your project is very welcome because you have this comparative dimension, in this case, not with Europe, which is obviously well ahead, but with Central Asia, with Southeast Asia, And there's many other examples of sub-regional cooperation that deserve to be studied, and I think certainly will help BBIN to take shape. Third, BBIN is not the same as SAARC and BIMSTEC. And often people get confused. You know, these people, I think many of us have heard this, but I like to stress this, that traditionally this idea that regionalism can only take root top down through heavy intergovernmental consultations, I think is outdated. So SAARC and BIMSTEC have their advantages, but I think in this world and day and age of flexible cooperation, sectoral cooperation, an initiative like BBIN has much more potential than these traditional old organizations. And finally, I think BBIN also will have challenges. It's not a boon that is falling from heaven and will take regionalism forward. There are many different challenges for BBIN. There's what I think Professor Rahman mentioned, the need for a political buy-in from the top. But at the same time, also, it will get political. We've seen this in the case of Bhutan and the MVA. And two temptations that I think are important to resist. One is formalization. I think there are advantages to informal mechanisms, and BBIN has achieved progress even through not having a secretariat and not a formal organization. And finally, the temptation of expanding. I think it's very dangerous to constantly expand and become excessively politically ambitious, bring in more countries beyond these four, etc. We hear it on BIMSTEC, people saying, let's expand BIMSTEC. And I'm sure you all agree. I mean, if BIMSTEC hasn't achieved much in 20 years, why should you solve anything by expanding it and bringing in Malaysia or other countries? I think that's not the solution. And therefore, small steps of success are the ones that will carry this habit of cooperation forward. Small, little focused steps. And let me just pass on the word for my last 3 minutes to my colleague Riya Sinha. She's a research associate who works with me here at Brookings India at the Samband Initiative. And Riya has been working both on the maritime side on the ports, but also on the land side on integrated checkposts. And she'll just share with you 3 very concrete examples of success on which BBIN can build on to bring in a bit of a positive momentum.
What I would like to focus on is we are always comparing either with Europe, with Central Asia, or with Southeast Asia for comparative learning for best practices. But what I want to emphasize here is that even within India, within the last few years, there have been certain initiatives that have been taken, particularly in the maritime domain, that have helped trade and logistics and can go forward and support BBIN initiatives as a motor vehicle agreement. My first suggestion would be to enable the community system that we have seen ports and the land ports and for the BBIN motor vehicles initiative as a whole. This will enable coordination between whether it is the custodian, the terminals, the transporters, even banks, for example, in enabling message exchange and facilitating message exchange. We often hear that there are no banks at, for example, Ruxol, ICP, or that the cargo transshipment declaration is being exchanged physically. This digital mechanism becomes more important because of the whole crisis that we are facing right now, and the way forward is actually more initiation of digitalization. The second suggestion would be towards enabling RFID at the containerized cargo or with the trucks. RFID is going to again enable seamless transportation within these 4 countries. India has worked well in developing this, and it is something that Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan can learn from. It's going to increase transparency, it's going to increase accountability, but trust building. This is one of the ways to achieve that. My last suggestion would be apart from the digital infrastructure, there is we speak about last mile connectivity, and that is going to be more important as we look at railways and inland waterways. While on paper it is easier to say that railways and inland waterways are the cheaper modes of transport, but when you add the last mile connectivity cost, it's much higher than road. So what can be done? As was discussed before, privatization, including private players, are very important. Third-party logistics, four-party logistics, very, very important to bring down logistics costs as a whole and get this whole initiative into momentum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vipul. That's
Yeah, is it over, Tino? Okay, thank you, Ria. Thank you, Tino, for sharing your thoughts. Now, in the interest of time, let me do it in this way. We have received some questions, not too many, but a number of observations. And all of them are very good, which will help us in taking this work forward. So, for example, you have received some very good suggestions from Mr. Jitesh Khosla, who is the former Chief Secretary of Assam, Mr. Purushottam Oja, former Commerce Secretary of Nepal, Mr. Manoj Kumar Roy, former Additional Secretary of Commerce of Bangladesh, and many others, including some of my colleagues. So we have made a note of all these observations, suggestions, and we'll take them forward in the best manner possible. We have to keep visiting them again and again and see how best that we can take them forward, keeping in mind overall objectives of this project. I mean, we have limited time, limited resources. We have to also take this into account. And the challenge before us is to do this constraint optimization, which we hope that we'll be able to do it well. Now, I have my proposal is to extend this session by another 14 minutes till 5:30, and then we'll call it a day. Since Mr. Wang, due to technical reasons, he couldn't complete his presentation, and then in some manner or the other, somehow I did that. So I would suggest at this stage to give the floor back to Mr. Wang, not for his presentation, but to tell us about the overall thinking about connectivity in this subregion, within the subregion, and this BBIN plus BBIN and its neighbors, particularly on the east with Southeast Asian countries. How ADB's thinking is fitting into that, including how do you see this ADB's SASEC work and this mConnect project about the complementarities that we have been talking about for the last few months. So over to you, Konchen.
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, I apologize my technical difficulty of losing all of you for some time. But thank you, people, for finishing the presentation for me. So my first point I would like to share with you is about the feasible approach. I have heard, for example, Tino mentioned that we probably should try some small steps and to build up some successful stories. And I think that's very useful. And that's just why that on my last slide, I mentioned that we should do a lot of problem identification, pilot testing. Let's do some baby steps to make sure the problem we are solving is exactly the root cause. Then based on this, we have the project. Yeah, traditionally that ADB want to serve our client countries. That's we have a lot of discussions starting from the high level strategic partnership down to the operational plan about which project to be financed. But we have our structure about how to develop the problem trees, how to develop the project output, outcome, impact based on design framing, the design DMF. But still, I think that we still need a lot of more collaboration and understanding with our developing countries, the clients, to see what we are going to do can solve the problems. And I would like to, even though we have quite a few technical assistance programs, however, I would personally, because this is not a really unified opinion about this, should we do more pilot testing? But personally, I think pilot testing is very useful. That helps us to make sure that this is indeed feasible, tangible, and the That's also helpful for minimize the uncertainty about the players, because I think the trust or uncertainty is a barrier a lot of serious than we thought. So I think if we can have some pilot runs or like a sandbox, like to make sure that the people understand what would happen and what is the impact, that would be it would be a lot easier to convince our partners to join us. So now that's the first point I would like to share with the audience. The second point is that I think that the cross-border connectivity is kind of a critical issues that has been recognized not only in the BBIN, as in the presentation for GMS, CARAC, people are looking at the same thing. So I think there's a lot of lesson that we can learn from each other, and so that makes sure that give us the suggestion that we are doing the right thing. And so the next one is how to do the things right. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Kuan Cheng. So let me respond to some of these points, including some of the observations which have been made so far, not just by the speakers, but also other participants. 2 or 3 points. One is that I'm not getting into the technicalities of transport or trade facilitation. But I think going forward, we have to understand the political meaning of the word flexible. And I'm glad that Tino has underlined this point. And there, I think I don't know much about Central Asia, but I know little about GMS. One of the reasons for the success of the GMS cooperation in the GMS region is flexibility. So that's something we should not discuss everything in technical terms. We have to discuss things in non-technical matter. I'll give you a very one example, very brief. When we are discussing this BBIN motor vehicles agreement, the protocols, we are organizing a meeting in Calcutta, and one of the participants raised a point when we are discussing possible elements in the protocol agreement, that if suppose Indian truck which has gone to Bangladesh, if it breaks down, so what will be the language that we should use in the protocol to address that? And my answer was that we do not need any provision, any protocol. For that, all we need is to find out where is the nearest repair shop and get a couple of mechanics to get that thing done. So we have to, by flexibility, I mean, we have to get out of this quagmire of technicalities, regulations, and think about the larger issues of cooperation and what benefits that each of us are going to get. Of course, benefits will not be same for everybody. We need to also understand that. Second, and this is particularly for India, I have no hesitation in saying this. In future, even now, I think we are negotiating in an old style negotiation. We have to get rid of the word reciprocity from our mind. We cannot have, for God's sake, heaven's sake, how can we have reciprocity with Bhutan, for example, or with Bangladesh, or with Nepal? We have to understand the value of less than full reciprocity and how less it could be. Even under significant less than full reciprocity, there is going to be gain for us. And most important gain, I would say, not in terms of rupee ana paisa, pound shilling pence, in that term, but in terms of having peace. Ambassador Karim, in one of his remarks, said that there is huge increase in poverty in Bangladesh as a result of this COVID, which is a worry not just in Bangladesh, but for all of us. And the similar situation is happening in India. I don't know much about Nepal or Bhutan, so I can't talk about that in those countries. So peace, what are the peace dividends that we can generate out of better connectivity? Security, not just the traditional sense of the term, non-traditional aspects of security. Why can't we have in Southern Africa, I know for sure, Southern African countries, they talk about food security not in terms of national boundaries, but in the regional sense. Why can't we have that kind of thinking? We have to have that kind of thinking. And food is something which is so essential. Let me quote Julius Nyerere, former president of Tanzania. He said, I quote, if I don't have a pair of shoes, and if somebody tells me, oh, you go to South Africa, the then South Africa, apartheid South Africa, you will get a pair of shoes, I'm not going to go there. But if there is no food in my stomach, if somebody tells me, oh, you go to South Africa and you will get food there, I'll go there. So it's not just economics. I mean, it's life, it's human rights, human life. So peace, security, stability. We have to have better stability in our region. I mean, we are so unstable in every sense of the term, particularly in our border areas. And incidentally, may not be incidentally, our border areas are much more poverty-ridden as compared to our non-border areas, which is a paradox, in my opinion. And finally, prosperity. How can you have prosperity? Through all such initiatives. So this is what I think we need to think much more carefully and come out with political solutions. And I'll end by saying, I don't know, maybe Professor Rahman or Tino or other speakers, Sriradha, Yubak, Julian, they may differ with me, but I have a strong feeling that we really do not understand our border areas in particular. There is a significant gap between the capitals and the hinterlands in terms of thinking, mindset. And this macro-micro gap is what is preventing us from getting benefits out of all. Even if there are initiatives which are in place, we're not getting that much of benefits out of them. So how can we bridge this gap in a language which is understandable to everybody, not in a non-technical language, in common language, in local language? That's something which we need to do as we go forward. Talking about that, I'll give you one example. There's the difference, 15 minutes difference in the lunch time in India-Nepal border posts. And it took us 4 years to change that, to align that. Because it was so difficult to convince our bureaucracy in New Delhi that, look, this is something which you can do. You don't need any legislation, anything. So here my proposal is, and finally it was done when we organized a meeting in Raxol-Birganj border, among the customs and other stakeholders from both sides. And they passed a resolution, sent it to their respective capitals, and then it was get done. So I think we need to think about such innovative initiatives on the border. We have this in India, Customs Clearance Facilitation Committee in all ports. Fairly good, not that bad, this institution. And there are counterparts in our neighboring countries. Why can't we have a mechanism for a monthly, or may not be monthly, but at least a quarterly meeting? I would say 80% of issues at the border level can get resolved if there is a mechanism in place for better understanding of regulatory issues for border crossing. If we start doing that and start thinking from that point of view, as against the technical matters of regulatory harmonization, I think we can make progress. So with that, unless any of you have any pressing, urgent, important, I'm falling short of words, issues to raise, I'll once again thank all of you. And we are going to, we have recorded it, so we're going to do the necessary editing and then send it to you and all other participants. And we are going to prepare a short report of the meeting. And I'm more of action agenda rather than who said what. And this is, as I said, this is a series of webinars, Inception webinars that we are doing. And this is getting taken together. I think we are going to get a lot of good inputs for better implementation of this work. So thank you once again. Our next webinar will be again on Tuesday, which is on 21st of July, same time. We have a very good panel there. Maybe instead of 1.5 hours, we'll at the outset said that it's going to be a 2-hour webinar. So thank you. But let's have 1 or 2 minutes more. If you have any particular point to raise, please do so. I think there is a saying that silence is concurrence. So on that note, let me call it a day. I mean, my colleagues, they have some more work to do. I have another webinar to attend at 6:30. Once again, I thank all of you and will be in close touch with all of you as we implement this project. Thank you very much. So I'm ending the meeting. Okay. So thank you, Kwancheng.